Good afternoon once again, colleagues, and thank you for joining our webinar series once again. We're on webinar number 2. Today we're dealing with cleaning of longitudinal data. And just as a reminder, these webinars are recorded and will be stored as a learning resource in the website of the Center of Excellence for Human Development. And we will provide an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the presentations. And there is also a Q&A tab that you can use to answer questions. So just to remind you of the webinars that we're going to be going through in this series. Yesterday, we started off with an introduction to the planning of longitudinal studies and data management, where we dealt with different tools that we can use to plan for longitudinal studies and ideas that we can use in terms of our approach for planning longitudinal studies. Today, we're going to be looking at exploring and cleaning longitudinal data. And we're going to skip a week, and the week after, on the 29th and the 30th, we'll look at the analysis of longitudinal data. Once again, there is an analytical toolkit that will be provided to all attendees for this series. And as you saw yesterday, we were dealing with R scripts, and wherever possible, I will provide an alternative for stata command. So there are some functions which as far as I'm aware, are only available in R and are not available in stata. Perhaps there are different ways of doing it in stata, which I'm not aware of. But for those which I'm not aware of, I will only provide the R version. And for the ones that I'm aware of, I will provide the stata commands. And the objectives for today's webinar are to gain insights into data harmonization, which we touched on yesterday, and also to learn tools for data visualization, to gain insights for handling missing data, and to gain insight into handling outliers. Once again, I want to foreground the importance of collection and organization of quantitative data, which is embedded in the definition of statistics. So when we're thinking of statistics, it's not only about the descriptive statistics or making inferences about a population from a sample, but even the operational aspects of collecting data are important elements of what we understand as statistics. And really the process that we take when we're analyzing data, we do not start with making inferences or even describing data, which is the descriptive analysis, but we start with data exploration. And in fact, even before that, it is a planning process where, that we talked about yesterday, to try and minimize as much as possible the errors that we can find in these kinds of data. And, we may not be able to deal with everything, but as much as possible, we can minimize some of these errors by putting in place the systems that we discussed yesterday. I was having a conversation with a friend who is in corporate and is a data analyst in the corporate world. And they were explaining to me how they experience difficulties even in corporate environment where they've got a lot of resources compared to us in academia. So they've got tools for tracking, for example, customers, and for tracking purchases and things like that. But still they do experience issues with some inaccuracies in data. So some of the things that we discussed, for example, yesterday, in terms of tracing participants, these are things that the databases or the systems incorporate are able to handle. I mean, we all know how call centers are able to constantly call us and make follow-up and able to record. And that's what we're trying to build within that's what, at least at DPHRU, where I worked before, and in the projects that I worked with, that's part of what we're trying to do, to try and build in that sort of a call center approach, so that we know when we've called participants and we're unable to get hold of them, we get alerts, for example, that will remind us to call those participants back. And that can improve issues such as attrition. So even before the exploration, what is covered here is when we already have the data. So we start with exploration of the data, the cleaning of the data, re-exploration, and describing the data, and then the inferential statistics. Now, just to remind us why we do these types of studies, longitudinal studies, as a definition, they follow the same individual or groups over time, and they're useful for observing change as well as stability, and also in terms of making inferring causal inference. Longitudinal studies are very important. When we talk about causality, two main factors that influence that make it difficult to make causal inference, what is called reverse causality and confounding. And both of those can be addressed in cohort designs and longitudinal studies. And, because how do you know, when you're looking at relationships, how do you know what happened first? So in a longitudinal design, you are able to assess the timing of whatever, whatever factors that you may be interested in, such that you are able to infer some causal inference, as well as the issue of confounding, which you can control for in a well-planned study. And also, I mean, in the areas that we operate in, but in human development, longitudinal studies are important for revealing biological, psychological, and social factors that influence the outcomes that we're interested in. It may be growth of children, it may be a learning outcome, it may be a health outcome, or it can be a behavioral outcome. And we understand that development is a process that happens over time, or that unfolds over time, hence the importance of longitudinal studies. And so these types of studies allow us to assess these changes, and also the timing of certain events during the life course of human development, such as the onset of puberty, for example, the timing of disease and the progression of disease. Now, just to now look at the different structure, the structure of longitudinal data. Data can be presented in different ways. So if you collect data, and for example, I'm going to use the example of spreadsheets, and you have in your data you've got multiple data sheets, for example, for wave 1, wave 2, wave 3. When you merge those data together, you can, as I mentioned yesterday, you can merge them in a horizontal manner, excuse me, and in such that you've got all the data for a particular individual in one row. So for example, if you've measured height 3 times for the same individual, you'll have all the heights for the first wave, the second wave, and the third wave of that particular individual in one row. That is what the wide format is, all right? So all the data are exactly for each individual are in exactly one row. In a long format, all the data for a variable are in one column. So all the height data, regardless of the wave regardless of the wave at which that data was collected, will be in one column. And what that does is that you will have multiple rows for each individual. So if an individual has got complete data for all waves, for all 3 waves, each individual will have 3 rows. So individual 1 will occupy row 1, row 2, row 3, with the height variable only in whatever specified column that it is in. All right. So that is a difference between the wide and the long format. And it's important to do that because it's to know that because in long format, that allows us then to apply longitudinal data analytics. It allows us to assess trends, whether it is over time. And also, you are able, when the data are in this long format, you are able to summarize them within each wave. And I will demonstrate how we do that. Now, there are three types of variables that you'll find in a longitudinal data set. You have the individual constant variables, which are variables that differ across individuals but remain fixed over time for each person. I will show an example of that. You've got time constant variables, meaning, and the word explains itself. So they're not influenced by time, and they remain fixed over time for each person. And you've got time varying variables, and as a word suggests, these will vary over time for each individual. And these are different examples of these types of variables. So, for example, if you've got a data set like I mentioned yesterday, the global data set where we had data from 6 countries, including South Africa, country is a constant variable for all children from South Africa. So we collected data between birth and 24 months. So that's not going to change throughout that period. But that is different, that variable is different to children from Pakistan, for example, who are also part of that cohort, all right? So you will have a country label for each child, which remains constant over time. And now time constant variables. So within a country, you will have variables that change between individuals, such as, for example, your sex and your year of birth, your date of birth. That will change from individual to individual. But over time, that variable does not change. You remain a male if you're male. You remain born on the date that you were born on. So that's not going to change over time. But your health status, your height, for example, or your weight, or your blood pressure, or your thoughts and perceptions about a particular service, or your score of your patient health questionnaire to measure probable depression, or your generalized anxiety disorder questionnaire, that may change over time. So that is the health status that changes, all right? And so that varies over time. And so within your data set, within your longitudinal data set, these are the types of variables that you're going to have. And it's important to know these variables and to label them even in your code book, because that is important in terms of how you're going to manipulate the data, to reshape the data from wide to long, or from long to wide. All right. Now, we spoke a little bit about harmonization yesterday, and the importance of harmonizing data across the different waves, but also importantly across different sites if you're working across different sites. I demonstrated how if you've got different names for the same variable at different time points, it's going to make it difficult to merge, and it's going to make it difficult to then for those variables to be recognized as the same variable. And some of the common issues that we experience in harmonization, the example that I gave yesterday is the unstandardized variable names. So somebody else may call, for example, age in years, as they may give a different name for age in years. So this is something that needs to be decided right up front, that we're going to call it either age underscore year, or we're going to call it age years. All right. And it's very important that we ensure that we were committed to that. And again, I'm going to emphasize the point that the systems that we build in RedCap, for example, they help to address some of these challenges. All right. And also the coding scheme. Some people may use numbers for coding a variable like gender, and they may use 1, 2, and others may use the full gender description, either male, female, or